This is the Taedonggang, famous for running through the heart of the DPRK's capital, Pyongyang. It's the fifth longest river on the entire Korean peninsula and flows from the Nangnim Mountains of South Hamgyong right out into the West Sea, here at Nampo. Along its route, the river sustains numerous towns and cities, directly supporting well over 6 million people living along its banks. But in reality, the river is even more important than that.
대동강의 자기 각 계통에 대한 수리 정보를 많이 짜고들어 진행하면서 운항할 수 있는 충분한 준비를 갖춰 놓고 시험 운항도 유력하게 진행했습니다.
This is what the Taedong River's path looks like when compared to a map of the country's agriculture. Only around 17% of the country's territory can be farmed, much of it along the Taedong River and in the surrounding provinces. The question is, with such limited arable land, how does the country operate its farms and sustain its agriculture? Farming in the DPRK is mostly concentrated here in these four western provinces: North Pyongan, South Pyongan, North Hwanghae and South Hwanghae, where the flat land, higher average rainfall and well-irrigated soil makes cultivation easier and historically more successful. On the opposite coast, between the cities of Wonsan and Hamhung, there exists a similar but smaller fertile region also used for agriculture. The rest of the country is dominated by mountains and forests, making it practically unusable for farming. Back in the early 20th century, while Korea was under Japanese rule, Tokyo attempted to entirely fold the Korean economy into its own, as part of a push for economic self-sufficiency within its empire. As a result, the population boom in Korea between 1910 and 1945, which saw the Korean population more than double, was sustained partly by the Japanese importing poor quality, long grain rice, often to make up for a shortfall in food availability due to the higher quality rice and soybeans which it demanded be exported from Korea back to Japan. However, with the end of the occupation in 1945, and liberation from the crumbling Japanese Empire, the newly divided Korea found itself with a growing population and the need for agricultural rejuvenation. 1946 brought sweeping land reforms across the northern half of Korea, introducing the concept of collectivized agriculture. Where once Japanese landlords had owned the farmland and had it worked by local Korean farmers, the state sought to group these farmers together to create collective or cooperative farms. By 1958, every farm in the country was collectivized. Each collective farm is managed by local committees at the village or county level. Typically, a collective farm in the DPRK is made up of between 300 to 500 people and encompasses around 500 hectares of land. These farms operate more like small villages and communities than industrial agricultural facilities, with separate units to deal with the administrative and management roles on the farm. The farms themselves are furnished with a local school, healthcare facilities, cultural facilities, shops, and of course, residential areas for the families. In exchange for rights to the land, the state provides these collectives with quotas to fulfill, along with the equipment needed to operate, such as fertilizers, pesticides, and agricultural training. Products from these farms are then sold directly to the state and then distributed nationally. Outside of these collective and cooperative farms, the remaining arable land in the country is made up of directly owned state farms. Since 1946, the Choson Nongobguroja Dongmeng, or Korean Union of Agricultural Workers, has overseen farmers across the country, providing representation in government for farm workers at the local and national level, as well as offering education on new agricultural methods. Agriculture in Korea cannot be understood fully without reading the 1964 Theses on the Socialist Rural Question of Our Country, which lays out the plans for implementing revolutionary new policies aimed at transforming the national farming infrastructure across the DPRK. Without going into too much detail, the overarching point of the thesis was to implement the Three Revolutions theory to Korean agriculture. The Three Revolutions movement was an ideological movement born in the early decades of the DPRK, which saw a push to simultaneously develop the national ideology, national culture, and the nation's technological capabilities. Ideologically, the theses outlined the importance of elevating the peasantry to stand alongside the urban working classes, the traditional base of support in socialist systems, and eliminating any distinctions between farmers and factory workers, changing the national peasantry instead into socialist farmers, and improve the livelihood of farming communities. Culturally, the collective farms began to be consolidated into regional groups under a local management committee, helping to coordinate production between previously disparate organisations. Technologically, the theses called for an expansion of irrigation across the nation's arable land, increasing the use of fertilisers, the mass adoption of mechanised agriculture, reclaiming tidal lands and other wetlands to expand the total amount of arable land available, and expanding access to electricity to countryside communities. The impact of these new policies was enormous. Where previously, agriculture had been continuing as it had for hundreds of years, these newly implemented policies led to the construction of over 3,500 pumps across the country by 1998, increasing the amount of irrigated land by 50 times to create new farmable territories, and the number of tractors in the country doubled, with an aim to produce 3,000 per year in 1973, targeting an average of 6 or 7 tractors per hectare of arable land. All in all, the theses brought Korean agriculture firmly into the modern age, and can be credited for achieving record-breaking harvests in the late 1980s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the DPRK endured what is locally known as the Arduous Mart, a series of food shortages which, later combined with natural disasters and latterly sanctions on fertilizer and farming machinery, led to economic difficulties. This resulted in new innovations across the agricultural sector, which have been continued to this day. One notable development is the increased number of greenhouses popping up around the country. Much of the DPRK's arable land is covered with frost for half the year, and so the implementation of greenhouse projects has allowed for increased annual production throughout the year. Greenhouses such as the Nyonpo greenhouse complex on the east coast and the Kangdong greenhouse, which opened in 2022, have been built on the sites of former air bases, with official government directives ordering the replacement of important military infrastructure with such greenhouse projects. In addition to these operations, a nationwide campaign to redevelop smaller towns and collective farms as part of a national push to improve living standards has seen collective farms across the country being rebuilt and renovated. Most recently, the new nationwide Regional Development 20x10 policy has seen a renewed push for constructing regional industry factories in 20 counties every year for the next decade. Whilst this policy is not directly linked specifically to agriculture, the broad initiative is focused on helping develop local industries, including the production of foodstuffs, which will no doubt impact local state and collective farms. And now, a quick word on the potato revolution. This is the music video for the song Gamchacharang, or Potato Pride, part of the so-called Potato Revolution of the late 1990s and early 2000s. As part of new innovations amidst the arduous march, potatoes enjoyed an increase in status, with much arable land being turned over to potato production. Cultivation of the vegetable in the DPRK increased from 50,000 hectares to over 200,000 hectares in 10 years. Notably, in the far northern Taehongdan County, which has since become locally famed for its potatoes and leading the nation in potato production. Potatoes were cropped alongside rice, allowing for higher overall yields from the available arable land. Potato pride, indeed.